And so the first word of encouragement I'll give is this, and that is, I didn't come up with this. I'm not quite this smart, but I don't know who to cite for this. Like I don't know. I'd love to be able to source it and say like, this is the really smart guy who said this. But it's this thought, and that's a crying church is a growing church. A silent church is a dying church. And I am very thankful to be in a growing church because I know that we have a lot of young families here, my own family included. And the only reason we don't have another reason for growing with us this morning is because Lydia is doing her own crying at home this morning as she's dealing with her fever. But never forget that. A crying church is a growing church, and it is good to be growing. Now, secondly, I originally had it in my notes that we're going to turn here and we're going to read it and we're going to spend about 5 minutes on this. But then when I looked at the rest of my lesson through our book today that we're going to be studying, I realized, you know what? I don't need to make a sermon out of this because I wanted to share this slide. I wanted to share this passage simply to say thank you. Because what we read in Acts chapter 2, at the end of this chapter, is that the Christians, the new believers, those that the Lord added to the church, they had all things in common. And we often turn to that passage and we lift up the one verse that says that they were gathered together daily to study the apostles' teachings. And that's good, right? That's the foundation of our church is the Holy Scriptures. That is where our lifeblood comes from, is understanding Jesus through His Word. But we actually form a church family by the rest of this passage, by sharing everything in common, by doing things like we did yesterday and having a work day in which most everyone was able to make it, and those that couldn't make it, it's because they were tied up with other work and family responsibilities. But everyone came together, and what would have cost, I don't know how many thousands of dollars and probably a week's worth of work, we were able to come together, and everybody brought their own knowledge and resources with them. And I mean, this was like a brand new church back here in these classrooms, and we knocked it out in 2 hours. I couldn't believe how fast we were able to get everything done. So I just wanted to say thank you for being a good church family and knowing that the church is more than just the preaching on a Sunday morning. I mean, coming together to study God's Word is important. Taking the Lord's table is necessary. But being a church family every day of the week and whenever the needs arise, that's important too. Don't overlook that. All right. So for our lesson today, we're continuing in our series, and as has been kind of my tradition the past couple weeks, I want to start with a New Testament passage to kind of set the tone, the principle that underlies what we're going to be talking about the rest of this lesson. So if you will, grab your Bibles and open up to 1 Corinthians 15, and we're going to read a few verses from the Apostle Paul that I believe encapsulates the book of Judges. That is our text for today. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 32 through 34. What do I gain if, humanly speaking, I fought with beasts at Ephesus? If the dead are not raised, then let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. Or some translations say, bad company ruins good character. Wake up from your drunken stupor, as is right, and do not go on sinning. For some have no knowledge of God, and I say this to your shame. Paul gives this teaching here in his Corinthian letter in the middle of his great defense of the resurrection of Jesus. That is the central message of chapter 15. Not that Paul wrote it in chapter form, but this section of the Corinthian letter is Paul's great defense of the resurrection. And Paul takes time to say that this central tenet of our faith, the thing that if Jesus is not raised, we are to be a pitiable people. We're the ones to be mocked and made fun of because we believe in a lie. The resurrection, the central doctrine, the bedrock and reason for our faith, in the middle of that defense, he says, bad company ruins good character. Why is that? Why include that here in this portion of the letter when he's talking about the resurrection? Paul is teaching that the entire reason that he tirelessly teaches Jesus everywhere he goes, even arguing with beasts in Ephesus. This is a term, this term of beasts in Ephesus is Paul's analogy to describe what it is like attempting to teach the truth of Jesus to crowds of wicked, profane, carnal, worldly-minded people. And he says, why should we not live like they do? Why not continue in gluttony like them? Why not continue to drink until our livers explode like them? Why not, in the words of Prince, party like it's 1999 and the world's going to end tomorrow? Why? Because when the world ends, that isn't the end. That's why. You don't live your best life today because you only get one life to have fun. You live your holiest life today because you only get one life to choose eternity. And Christ's resurrection is the grand evidence that just as he is raised, we will be raised. And when that happens, those faithful in body will continue to live faithfully and be faithfully raised with him to continue in joy with the Father. But for those who are not faithfully obedient in body, well, they'll face the consequence of their disobedience. And for that reason, Paul says, choose your friends wisely, because bad company will corrupt your Christian character. Now use that as the opening passage for our lesson today, because I believe that the book of Judges can be summed up with this word. When you forget the word, you become the world. If you remember, the theme message for the Torah series that we went through, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was that God took Israel out of Egypt through signs and wonders, but God took Egypt out of Israel through the power of his word. And it is in the book of Judges that we have this tragic history of what happens to a people when they abandon God's word. And so as we go throughout this lesson, we're going to follow this outline that we've been keeping for a while now. We're going to spend a few moments on the historical context, and then I'll probably pause to cough a little bit because I'm finding a bit of a head cold and I've already burnt through one cough drop. So you might see me have to hit my water canteen or pop in another cough drop. I might make it to the summary of content before I need to do that. And then we'll do a little summary of the key events in Judges. And then, as is our tradition, we'll close with, I've got 6 lessons for us to consider today that we can take from the book of Judges. For the historical context, we're going to look at what happens before this book. And that's from 1446 to 1406 BC, Moses led Israel. He was chosen by God to not just lead them out of Egypt, but to give them the law which would govern their holy behavior. And the purpose, as we already said, of the law, of Moses' writings, of Moses' shepherdship, was to take the Egyptian ways out of the Israelites and form them into God's holy people who lived distinctly and set apart lives that were far more righteous, undeniably righteous, than that of all of their neighbors. And then, as we discussed last week in the book of Joshua, from 1406 BC to sometime in the late 1300s, the dating for when Joshua dies, I couldn't find a really good answer for that. We just don't know for certain, but in the late 1300s is when Joshua dies. But Joshua leads Israel on the conquest to secure the promised land, that which had been given to them by God. And while they are securing that land, what is God doing? God is exercising capital punishment against the Canaanites who have been on a downward spiral of wickedness for 400 years. For more information on that, refer back to last week's lesson. Which brings us to the present for the book of Judges, which goes from the late 1300s up until about the late 1100s-ish. Again, the dating of Judges, there's some wiggle room in there, but it spans roughly 300 years worth of time. And the reason there's a little bit of wiggle room here is because when you read through the accounts of the judges, sometimes there's a definitive chronology, like it was this judge for X number of years, and then it was this judge for X number of years. But there's a number of the judges or a number of the events that coincide and happen at the same time, and so we don't have a good picture of the exact timeline. Not that anyone really cares for the exact timeline. It's just important to know, roughly, we're talking 300 years come to pass, and the Canaanites are still in the land. Israel was supposed to drive them out, but during this entire time, the Canaanites are still in the land. And we're going to read about what happens because of that. But then after the book of Judges, the prophet Samuel is born. And he is the great prophet and the great final judge of Israel who would act as an advisor to King Saul and to King David. So that's kind of the historical setting that we find ourselves in with the book of Judges. And so as we turn to the content can be summarized as this. I didn't make this slide. I guess I made the slide. I didn't make the picture with the fancy chart. I did the bullet points that will come up here in just a second. But if you look at this chart, this is an infamous chart for the book of Judges. If you just on your own just Google search summary of Judges, you will find 1,000 different versions of this same chart. I just picked one that I thought was the prettiest, or the one that I thought fit the slide the best, right? Because if you read through Judges, there is an undeniable pattern that happens throughout the text. It's a very depressing and tragic pattern. What we see during this 300 years throughout this book is that Israel serves Yahweh. And then Israel does what is evil in his sight by turning to idols and immorality. So then God punishes Israel by allowing the Canaanites to conquer them, the very same people that the Israelites were mimicking. The people that Israel, instead of looking to God as their example for living, they looked to the Canaanites on how to live. And then God says, if you want to be like them so much, I'll just let them rule over you and see what that life looks like. So God allows this to happen, and then Israel cries to God for help. So then God raises up a judge to rescue them. Israel is saved. Israel serves God until they don't serve God anymore, and then they turn to idolatry and immorality. And this cycle goes round and round and round. And the one thing I added here is this little curly Q here, this downward spiral I added in. Because as the book of Judges goes around this cycle, each time it does this cycle, it gets worse. The sins of Israel get worse and worse and worse with each cycle that goes through. So let's just take a few minutes and look at some of the events that happen during this cycle. I believe that this book can be divided into what I see as 4 divisions. As I've said in previous lessons, everybody has their own idea of how many divisions it can be in. It's just one letter. But I see 4 clear divisions here in the text that I would challenge you to read for. And section 1 is chapters 1 through chapter 3, verse 8. I believe we can see that as one distinct portion of the text. And in section 1, it serves as the narrator's summary for the entire book. It's in these opening chapters that it explains all that is about to be described throughout the rest of the letter. How is it that things got so bad? And so the narrator here, who many believe is the prophet Samuel, we don't know definitively, but it is most likely the prophet Samuel who wrote the book of Judges, is giving us this snapshot. Hey, this is how things got so bad. Here's what you can expect as you read throughout the rest of this writing. And then the next section is where the bad really begins to take place. Things are getting bad. In chapter 3, verse 9 through chapter 5, we have the first round of judges that God raises up. We have Othniel, who is strengthened by God to defeat by military might Israel's enemies that were their slave masters. And then as the cycle goes and Israel turns back to wickedness again and they pray to God and then God raises up another judge, the next judge that God raises up is Ehud. Ehud is the famous judge that stabs the evil fat king and he's so fat that that his fat rolls absorb the sword. And so it's this really graphic, kind of almost comic book-like tale of, there's the one side of me that's like, oh, wow, how gruesome, wow. And then there's that part that's like, man, it's actually like really bad. Like, that is the level of kingship and rule that was in the land. But anyway, we have this famous tale of Ehud. And then the last of the kings in this cycle is that of Deborah and Barak, who are helped by God to lead Israel against a military victory against King Jabin of Hatzor. And thanks to my archaeology course that I took a year ago, I learned that this actually would have been Israel's greatest military battle, most likely, because Hatzor was like the capital city for all the Canaanite tribes. This was, the king of Hatzor was considered like the king of kings throughout all of Canaan. And so for God to lead them against this mighty Hatzor army would have been a miraculous victory. But we see an early sign that things are starting to go south, because we see that though God emboldened Deborah and Barak to lead this victory, it was actually another Canaanite woman who secured them the victory. So it wasn't even the Israelite soldiers themselves that won the battle. It was help from an outside Canaanite source. So these things are already starting to unravel for Israel's faith in the way that they lean on God to be their victor. And that brings us to the next section, and that's where things go from bad to worse. Chapter 6 begins with this text. And Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And that brings about the next round of judges. And this is where we really begin to see a progression downward into how immoral the Israelites are starting to become. We see that Gideon is the next great judge that God lifts up. And he famously leads the army of 300 soldiers against an enemy force of over 100,000. And they win because God was fighting with them. However, as I said, this is where things start to really noticeably get worse. As mighty of a judge and leader as Gideon was, after his victories, his personal life became ruined by his love for money and his love for women. He makes a golden idol, and he takes many wives and concubines for himself. And Gideon's actions directly lead to the nation of Israel's next great downfall, which would be the false king Abimelech, one of Gideon's sons. Abimelech, through deceptive backdoor dealings, hires a group of thugs to go out and kill his 70 brothers, and then imposes the title upon himself, I am the king of Israel. And this false king was a terrible, terrible leader. And we see the nation of Israel breaks out into a civil war. After Abimelech loses and he is killed, Israel returns to going back to sin and doing what was right in their own eyes by worshiping idols, which leads to God allowing them to be enslaved by their Canaanite neighbors again. So then God raises up the next judge, which is Jephthah, who in fact leads Israel to another mighty victory as he is empowered by God. And yet Jephthah is famous, or infamous rather, for making his foolish vow of offering to God a human sacrifice. The one sin that is arguably the one God hated the most, and the very judge whom God lifted up to lead the people believes that this is pleasing. The pattern is clear. Even the leaders that God is raising up to rescue Israel have forgotten God's commands. They have lived for too long trying to mix Canaanite religion with the worship of the one true God, Yahweh. And even the best of Israelite leaders can no longer rightfully see the truth. Which brings us to Samson. Though he's famous for his strength and killing a lion and killing many Philistines, and I don't know how many great, wonderful, powerful VBS lessons have been done on Samson, but if you read his life, it is not a life of heroism, it is a life of tragedy. The great judge Samson lives basically his entire life in hedonism. He's raised up by God in only a few brief moments in his life to defeat the Philistines. And it is Samson that's the background image for the rest of the slides, because I believe that Samson's life represents kind of a microcosm for the entire history of Israel at this time. Because we can see how his own life spirals down. He starts out with great faith in God, but then very quickly turns to riches, women, idol worship. It's a terrible tale. But there's an important point here with Samuel that I believe needs to be drawn out now, and that's this. Before he was a slave to the Philistines, he became a slave to his own sins. And that is the fall that describes Israel throughout this book. Before they became enslaved to their enemies, they were enslaved by their own sins. And then that brings us to the final division of the book of Judges. This is the worst of the worst. The downward spiral continues. In chapters 17 through 18, the entire tribe of Dan, they pay off a Levitical priest to lead them in worshiping idols made of silver for the explicit purpose of receiving more material blessings. And then they commit a genuine genocide in wiping out an entire town. You see, unlike the battles that we read about in Joshua, where these battles were an extension of God's capital punishment for sin, the Danites wipe out an entire tribe specifically because they wanted the wealth and the riches that came with the land. By the end of chapter 18, the entire tribe of Dan is guilty of covetousness, stealing, idolatry, murder, having carved images, setting up a false priesthood, and taking land that was not authorized by God. And that's not even the worst part. In the closing chapters of Judges, in 19 through 21, this is the true, below the gutter, scum of the earth type stuff. This is how far Israel falls. The tribe of Benjamin seek to rape and murder a priest. However, the priest remains behind locked doors while he sends out his wife to die in his place. What a great heroic husband he is, isn't it? After she is brutally abused and killed, this Levitical priest sends a message out to all of Israel about what has happened. And then all 11 other tribes, they band together to go to war against Benjamin. Finally, someone in Israel did something so profane that the rest of the nation is now ready to stand up and say, okay, maybe there are limits that we can tolerate. Maybe there's a line that we shouldn't cross. And so God is just as outraged as the rest of Israel by the sins of Benjamin, and he blesses off on, I won't even call it necessarily a civil war, because it was absolute capital punishment from 11 of the tribes against the Benjamites. So that's what happens. Israel punishes Benjamin forcefully with great military might. But then afterward, after they put to death those who were guilty of this great sin, they felt bad about it. They extended mercy where God did not extend mercy. And their unlawful mercy resulted in even greater sin. Out of their guilt for the rightful punishment that they just did on God's behalf, they go out and they slaughter an entire village, and they kidnap hundreds of young girls, and they offer them as an apology letter to the tribe of Benjamin. This is not a happy ending. This is not an example of, this is a good Christian life that we should live by. This is not the Israelites being God's people as He had called them to be. And the final verse of Judges says it all. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. With such a graphic, violent, and depressing story, what do we do with this? Like what lessons do we take from Judges today? Well, before I get into the actual lessons of some application, I want to share with you how should we read this text? Because it can bring about a lot of difficult questions about God, about faith, about humanity, about morality. And so the first thing that I want to share with you is this. As you read through Judges, made it longer than I thought I would. Read each event through the lens of the first section. I'm going to give just a sample reading here from Judges chapter 2. I'm going to start in verse 2. I'm going to read a sampling that I have up on the screen. You shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. What is this that you have done? So now I say, I will not drive the Canaanites out before you. They shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. And all of that generation were gathered to their fathers, speaking of the generation of Joshua. And there arose the next generation after them, who did not know the Lord or the work that He had done for Israel. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned God, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among them and all the peoples that were around them, and they bowed down to these idols. They provoked Yahweh to anger. They abandoned Yahweh and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and He gave them over to the plunderers. Throughout this first section, we clearly see how Israel had violated God's commands. They made peace treaties, they intermarried, they joined in worship with the Canaanites. All of this was in direct violation to God's good word. And the wickedness that the Israelites are guilty of committing is not approved by God in the slightest. And in fact, it is punished by God time and time again. So the second thing that we need to look at, sorry, forgot I had a slide for that one, is that we need to read each portion of Judges to see how God continues to work through the brokenness of His people. As we've seen, even Israel's leaders began to fall very short of God's expectations, and yet God continued to still be patient, even in His judgments, by raising up leaders from among the best that Israel had to offer. God using broken humans to bring about good does not mean that God endorses or supports the sinful behaviors of those broken people. It means He was always there trying to promote them to be better from where they were, to get them to where He knew they could be. And that brings us to our principles for application today. And the first is this. In Judges, we see what happens when God is forsaken. Many times throughout this book, it is said of Israel that they did not know God and they forsook God. And what I find interesting about these descriptions that are repeated time and time again is this. Israel always knew God. When the text says that Israel did not know God, it does so while at the same time saying that they confessed to God and prayed for His deliverance. So obviously they did not entirely forget about Him. What we see is that what they were guilty of is they forgot the exclusivity of God. They forgot the true nature of God. They never abandoned God entirely. They began worshiping other gods at the same time. And when it says they forsook God, the term of forsaking means to leave behind. What Israel was attempting to do was they believed they could progress as a society if they left God in their rearview mirror. They leave behind God's moral laws because they believe that's what was keeping them down. And what did that get them? Well, the same thing that it gets us today. When you don't have God as the foundation of your life and for your behavior, you are free to behave however you please, and that's not a good thing. Without God at the center, Israel forgot not just God, not just his teachings, but they forgot the inherent, intrinsic value of human life as they began to steal, worship money, demand sex, sacrifice their own children. As I started this lesson out, Judges, if nothing else, teaches us that when you forget the word, you become like the world. We see this playing out in our own country before our eyes. Those without God as their foundation increasingly justify sin as a good thing. We see this where riots are applauded, assassination attempts against political leaders are praised. What's promoted in the public space is that you can have sex with anyone, anywhere, because that is a right that you have, even at the expense of including children in those acts. Children who, by the way, can be murdered in a mobile abortion center on the public streets outside of a political campaign. As the famous Russian novelist Dostoevsky wrote, "If there is no God, all things are permissible." That was true in the events of Judges, as Israel behaved as if there was no God. And we are seeing it come true today, which brings us to our second point for us to consider, is that we see that the gods of Canaan are still worshipped today. In Judges 6, 28 through 35, we read of Israel's loyalty to the Canaanite gods of Baal and Asherah. These were the two primary Canaanite gods of fertility, the male Baal and the female Asherah. They were worshipped by open, lewd, sexually deviant acts, and they were worshipped by child sacrifice. And both of these behaviors were done in the name of worship because the Canaanites and the faithless Israelites believed that by doing these things, they would be given more wealth, more prosperity, that they would have a happier life. We may not call them Baal and Asherah today, but the mindset that drove their worship is still very alive. The question that we must ask ourselves is this: will we be like Israel and be guilty of flirting with the enemy until we become that which God hates? Or will we remain true to God? Which brings us to our third point. Bad company corrupts good character. This is a critical lesson to learn. And I know everyone thinks they're the exception to this. And we hear it all the time. I don't need the church. I don't need Christian friends. I'm religious, but I don't need worship. I don't need Christians because I'm spiritual. We all think that we are as strong as Jesus, that we can walk alongside anyone and not be influenced by worldly corruption. All the while, we fail to realize that God stopped walking with us a long time ago because in the name of fitting in the name of being liked, in the name of not being offensive, we've walked far further than Jesus ever would have. We walked with the world to the point that we walked away from God. Why do you think this teaching of bad company corrupting good morals is from God? Because He knows better. He's the one who made us. He's the one who knows our hearts. He's the one who knows our fallen nature, and He's the one that knows that if we are left to our own devices, we will tend toward sin. We need to stop trying to fit in with the world. We need to ensure ourselves that we are surrounded by Christian values. I want you to think about it this way. What's in a week? Well, there's 168 hours in a week. Don't read too much into the exact numbers. I was given just kind of rough estimates by my own not so scholarly observations. But what I have here is that we spend about 8 hours a day of resting. There's a lot of parents here that don't get anywhere near close to that. We spend about 10 hours a day on work or school-related activities. We spend about 8.5 hours per day with leisureliness or various chores and household things that we need to take care of and entertainment and extracurricular activities. And if you go to church, you might spend 3 hours per week on your faith. What this equates to is 1/3 of your life sleeping, 2/3 of your life focused on worldly matters, and a whopping 2% of your life spent on faith if your only spiritual edification happens in this building. If the only time you think about God and His Word happens here, 2% of your life is dedicated to God. The other 98% is dedicated to this physical life. So you tell me, if this graph represents your life, which one is going to influence your attitude, your behavior, your beliefs, your dreams, your goals, your desires more? 98% or 2%? As a little litmus test, consider this question. How often do you say something like this? Well, so-and-so did XYZ. And so-and-so down the street, they have XYZ thing. If you regularly define what you do and who you are by what everyone else is doing, you're being influenced by the 98%. We're wrapping up here with just the last couple points. We see in Judges that rightly knowing God helps one to rightly obey God. There is an intellectual side of faith that requires intentional thought. Part of the reason for maintaining a connection with a Christian community is to share knowledge, to share experience. As we talked about in our Bible class, to share one another's burdens, to learn and to support one another. And the more time that we spend knowing God, the more that we will come to love Him for who He is. And the more that you will genuinely seek to serve Him out of that love. And the more that you will trust Him with your life because you know Him. That's why it's so important for us to be in His Word and to not forget it. One of the most important matters of the conduct that we have in this life is this fifth point, that we need spiritual leadership. Israel lacked leaders. It lacked national leaders. It lacked religious leaders. It lacked leaders in their communities. It lacked leaders in their homes. At every level of life, Israel lacked men and women who were willing to stand up against evil. This might not be a politically correct saying, but I hope you know what I mean by this phrase. Israel had too many Indians, but not enough chiefs, was the problem that they faced. Because they kept waiting for God to raise up a leader using the excuse, it's not my job to raise my children. It's not my job to tell my neighbor that he can't worship Baal. It's not my job to fight against the Canaanites who are stealing my food, my women, and my children. That's somebody else's job. They completely forgot that during the time of Moses, they were explicitly commanded that all of them were to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. No, they might not all have been priests serving in the tabernacle, but every single one of them was to be a religious leader for where they were in life. It's the same language that Peter gives us in the New Testament. If you are a Christian, you are a spiritual leader. The question is, how are you leading? There may be different roles for leadership, just as Israel had priests and prophets and judges and kings, and just as the New Testament church has teachers and preachers and deacons and elders and evangelists, there might be these different titles and offices that we use, but all Christians are to be leading others to God in some capacity. And there is absolutely a role for the silent leaders, those who are kind of working behind the scenes, who love and serve the Lord by their example, by their quiet conduct, by their positive attitude, and by the way that their influence may only go as far as their own household family and their immediate neighbors, but that influence can change the world. That type of leadership is needed. But there is also a role for public leadership too. And those who have a public ministry bear a great responsibility because they may influence hundreds, if not millions of people in this technological age. And those leaders do not have the luxury of remaining silent. And yet, too often, those with the greatest influence remain silent on the important issues because they fear of offending the masses. They'll let the sheep jump off of a cliff before they risk upsetting the wolf. So the challenge here is this: don't let the scope of your influence change the message of God. If you are leading a family, lead them with God's word. If you're to the point of leading an entire community or to a nation, you still lead with the same word of God. No matter where you are, don't stop being a Christian leader. That was one of Israel's great failures. And the last point that I have is that in Judges, we see that greatness does not depend on who you are, but who God is. And this might actually be, in my personal opinion, knowing that this is a church family that truly does love the Lord and seeks to serve Him, this might be the most encouraging point of all. And the reason is because I know that you guys love the Lord. But I also know that, just as a matter of proverbial truth, the number one reason why Christians fail to be the leaders they can be is because they fear that they don't know enough, or that they aren't good enough to speak about their faith and to tell others about Christ. And so if that describes you, if you're afraid to share your faith, here's the good news. It's not about you. It's not about your abilities. It's about God. Consider these words that God gives as encouragement to Gideon when God is calling up Gideon to be the leader for Israel. Judges chapter 6, verse 15. And Gideon said to God, "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in all of Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." And the Lord said to him, "But I will be with you." I want you to remember God's word. Every time you get nervous about defending or sharing your faith, whether it's with a classmate, a family member, a total stranger on the street, and then you start to talk yourself out of it. And there's that self-doubt that comes in that says, well, I just don't know what to say. I'm going to mess up. I'm not good enough. They don't want to hear what I have to say. But God is with you. He is the one that is going to lead people to Christ. We're just the messengers. That is a wonderfully powerful encouragement. So as we conclude, when you forget the word, you become the world. As we've seen in this lesson, the book of Judges is not a textbook of things that we should do to honor God. It's a textbook of everything we should not do. But chiefly, we've seen that what this life will look like without God in it. It is selfish, it is lustful, it is violent, it is anarchist, it is chaotic, it is evil. And this is why we should want to be a Christian all that much more. Because through Christ, we have both redemption and forgiveness from our past. And through Christ, we have a solid moral grounding for how to live in the present and the future, so that the chaos and the sins of the world that we read about in Judges, that we see happening all around us today, so that we don't succumb to that influence. Christ has given us a set of moral teachings that are for our good, and that will transform all of life's sin and death into a life of abundance and eternal joy. And I say that with the utmost confidence because the one who made us knows what is best for us. And what is best for us is to be saved from our sin by being united with Christ and living faithfully by His word. So if there's anyone here this morning That when you've been hearing these accounts of the failures of Israel and you've recognized, wow, I've done some pretty bad things too that I've not yet tried to make right with God. Now's your time. Now's your time to get right with God. When you've got a Christian family who loves you and who supports you. So if there's anyone here that is struggling with anything that we can help you with to walk rightly with God, to love Him better, to know Him better, we ask that you would let us know as together we stand and sing.